Hello, dear friends. Today's lecture is on a very famous author, Margaret Atwood. You must have heard her name, and literature wise, she comes from a country which has produced some really wonderful authors, but their names are not heard that often. But particularly Margaret Atwood is a very, very well known name, and she comes from Canada. She has received many awards and she is recognized as a frontline feminist writer. In this lecture, I'll be speaking briefly about her biography and her works. Atwood is internationally acclaimed as a novelist, poet, and a short story writer. She has emerged as a major figure in contemporary feminist writing through female protagonists and narrators who often journey from victimization to self actualization. Atwood explores women's issues using elements of science fiction, historical fact, fairy tale, and dystopian vision. Here we need to understand a few things. Now, generally, in fiction and other forms of work, the protagonists are males, and females or women, they acquire a backdrop kind of position. Now, Atwood sort of turns the tables and she introduces female protagonists. And what we need to understand is that there has been a victimization of women in different marginalization, you can call it victimization of women in different ways. And very often, some women have stood against, though, that kind of victimization or any kind of pressure that is put upon them. And they take a journey of their own. Now, this journey in the outside world is not easy in a patriarchal setup. But while they struggle, they reach some kind of a point where comes the point of self actualization. Now, what do we understand by self actualization? Self actualization is something when a person really understands who he or she is, or a sort of philosophical, practical kind of notion of what their capabilities are. And after all, why are they there in this world? What about their self respect? What are their talents? What they really seek in life? This seeking could be spiritual, it could be in any form, but this is knowing your own self. Now, so you can see that in most of her novels, there is this journey of a female protagonist who moves from victimization towards a higher kind of goal of self actualization. Now, for that, she has used different kinds of things, like she has used science fiction, advanced science fiction, sometimes she uses historical facts, fairy tales also. And by dystopian vision, what is meant is that you imagine a different kind of world where things happen in completely different kind of manner, an imaginary world. But whatsoever the world is, the journeys are taken up by women in Atwood's fiction and writing. Now, a little bit about her biography. She was born in Ottawa, Canada, and grew up in suburban Toronto. As a child, she spent her summers at her family's cottage in the wilderness of northern Quebec, where her father, a forest entomologist, conducted research. She began to write while in high school, contributing poetry, short stories, and cartoons to the school newspaper. As an undergraduate at the University of Toronto, Atwood was influenced by the famous critic Northrop Frye, who introduced her to the poetry of William Blake. Now, looking at her biography, you can see that she got a lot of time to spend in the wilderness, very close to nature, and her father, herself being her father was a researcher, and so you can see that she grew up uh, in the middle of nature and in a family which was a family of academicians and researchers. And from very early on, she started in her school by contributing poetry and short stories. She started writing very early. And later on, in university, she was really influenced by this wonderful critic, Northrop Frye. And looking at her talent and inclinations, Northrop Frye introduced her to the poetry of William Blake, who had a huge influence on her. Atwood was very impressed with Blake's use of mythological imagery, and she wrote her first volume of poetry, Double Persephone, which was published in 1961. The following year, Atwood completed her MA degree at Radcliffe College, Harvard University, and she returned to Toronto in 1963, where she began collaborating with artist Charles Fetcher, who designed and illustrated several volumes of her poetry. Here, what we need to understand and keep our focus on is that mythological imagery which was used by Blake and Atwood, who was impressed by it, it introduces actually the use of myths and mythological imagery. It introduces several layers into any kind of work, whether it is poetry, several layers of meanings, whereby one character can be associated with some kind of mythological characters, and their paths they crisscross. Sometimes the outcome is the same. Sometimes you get reflections or histories repeating themselves. So they provide a great deal of depth to any form of writing if mythological structure or imagery is used. And then you can see that she collaborated with Charles Patcher, who was a designer. So and he illustrated several volumes of her poetry. So you can see that it her poetry is very visual in nature, which goes very close to her childhood experience of looking at nature very closely, observing it. So, in her poetry, right from myths to nature to close observation of human life and mythological structures, she has a lot of rich variety. Thank you.